Good day, everybody. My name is Jane Badham, and I am a consultant to the Helen Keller International ARCH project, which does work around the assessment and research in child feeding. I am going to be presenting in this session on the work of the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses and the work they are doing around the revision of the follow-up formula standard. To begin with, I do need to remind us that not only is exclusive breastfeeding from birth to 6 months vitally important, but we cannot forget that continued breastfeeding to at least 2 years is also part of the global recommendations. And it is also this period where we find a lot of threat happening to breastfeeding by those involved in the private sector, because this is also a highly lucrative market, just as is the infant formula market. This is very clearly shown in this slide, where you can see the growth in follow-up formula markets across countries, taken from the Euromonitor. The data is from 2017, but in fact we know that the trend is that it's only growing more than what we're seeing here. And what you see is almost double figure growth in the low and middle income countries in every case. At the same time, you're seeing countries with high stunting rates. And yet, if you look at the bottom, at the higher income countries, what we see here is not only that we don't even have stunting rates for these countries, but we see a negative growth in the follow-up formula sales. So without doubt, it is in the low and middle income countries where breastfeeding is needed most that we are actually seeing these very high growths in the sales, volume growth in the sales of these products. And we need to be concerned, because if we use the cost of not breastfeeding, we see that from not breastfeeding, we have a mortality that could be avoided of over $1 billion a year. If we look at lost earnings, it climbs to a staggering almost $54 billion a year, lost because we are not breastfeeding. And then, almost beyond comprehension, is the cognitive losses, sitting at some $285 billion a year. So if we want to look at the total economic losses of not breastfeeding, we see this figure of some $341 billion. And if we turn that into global gross national income percentage, we see it's almost 1%. So we have every reason to be concerned by the fact that we are seeing these declines in breastfeeding and these huge increases in the sale of the formula products. So let me now introduce you to the Codex Alimentarius, which is a joint body of both the WHO and of the FAO. All United Nations member states can be members of Codex Alimentarius, and this body is about a standard setting body. Although it is not binding the standards they set, you are going to see very shortly that is very hard not to follow the Codex standards. So you will see 189 member states can be part of Codex. And you should also note that very often at the Codex Alimentarius meetings, country delegations have non-government participants. We also currently see that there are 240 observers. These are non-state actors, such as international organizations, civil society, and industry associations. but I point out here that the vast majority represent, in fact, the private sector. You will see the UNICEF logo on these slides, and at this point I would really like to thank Kathy Schatz, the legal specialist at UNICEF, for giving me permission to share these slides in this presentation. So we've said that Codex is made up of member states. They develop a body of text which are either standard or guidelines, and these texts have a dual mandate of both protecting consumer health and removing barriers to trade. And the real objective is to try and promote international harmonization. Codex works through committees, and two of those committees are the Committee on Nutrition and Special Dietary Uses and the Committee on Food Labeling. And I mention these two committees because they are intimately involved in the current work on the revision of the follow-up formula standard. We talked about the fact that Codex is a balance between public health and trade. And this has a lot to do with the World Trade Organization, which in itself is a balance between rights and obligations. So any WTO agreements are designed to try and find this balance between rights, in other words, regulating, and obligations, in other words, facilitating trade. So WTO members can implement measures and regulations, but they are required that they should not be discriminatory, they should not be more trade restrictive than necessary, and they should achieve a legitimate objective, for example, to protect human health. Some WTO agreements either require or strongly encourage the use of international standards like Codex. This is showing you the importance then of Codex, because under the TBT agreement, following international standards creates a rebuttable presumption that a measure does not create an unnecessary obstacle to international trade. So this is a really important body, and the work of Codex cannot be ignored. And we've seen that often, in fact, WT and Codex have these interjoining and interlinking issues. And here you will see an example of when Thailand was putting together its measures to mandate the code and regulate the code in Thailand. You will see here that a number of people submitting comments to the Thai government put in front of them these issues of World Trade Organization, reminding them that they should follow international standards, encouraging them that they should consider the standards that exist, and therefore really putting pressure on them not to do anything that was stricter or stronger than some of the standards. When it comes to follow-up formula, I do want to remind you that the Convention of the Rights of the Child says that all segments of society should make sure that the advantages of breastfeeding are clearly made known, are educated on, and are supported. I also want to draw your attention to the WHO guidance on ending the inappropriate promotions of foods for infants and young children that were adopted as part of World Health Assembly Resolution 69.9. And it is really important to note that this guidance clearly states that follow-up formula are breast milk substitutes. And you will see that they also make it clear that any of these products should not be promoted. This was passed in 2016. We're now in 2021, and we are seeing very little implementation of this guidance, which is hugely concerning, as is the fact that we've celebrated 40 years of the code and still we are seeing great violations of the code. So when we look at follow-up formula, we must also look at the evidence. And the evidence is clear that breastfeeding declines substantially when follow-up formula is consumed. And the promotion of follow-up formula undermines that continued breastfeeding that I talked about in the beginning. So despite the fact that the WHO has stated that follow-up formula is not necessary, this was agreed to by members of the World Health Assembly, the markets for these products continue to grow. And as I showed you earlier, it is growing in the low middle income countries while declining in some high income countries. And countries that are experiencing high stunting rates are seeing the greatest market growth. You can see the images cross-promote. So we see a huge amount of promotion of these products despite them being unnecessary and despite the fact that they undermine breastfeeding. So let's take a look at the participation of Codex. And I think this graph really depicts so clearly the very worrying concern. When you see on the left at the Codex Committee on Food Labeling and on the right the Codex Committee for Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses, if you look at the white block, that represents the government participation, remembering that a number of governments actually have private sector delegates within their delegations. And if you look then at the blue area, which is industry and industry advocate NGOs, you will see that in some cases, and almost at the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses, the industry participation outweighs the government participation. So we can see that not all interests are represented equally at Codex. But all member states can support the development of evidence-based Codex standards free from conflicts of interest that prioritize child rights, protect breastfeeding and child health. And this is absolutely what is critical and essential. But as you can see, it is hard to achieve at Codex. So with that background, I want to share with you, and I'm going to go through some of these slides quite quickly, but I want you to understand what is the status and what will be the key items for discussion at the upcoming meeting that is happening at the end of November of the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses as they review the standard for follow-up formula. I will start by telling you that Codex is a complex organization until you really get to understand it. It follows an 8-step process, and texts move through these 8 steps. At all points there is discussion and comment, and Codex always tries to work to the point of consensus. And consensus often is only achieved through compromise along the way. But when a Codex standard or a Codex guideline gets to step 8, that is when it is submitted to the Executive Committee, and it will then be endorsed and adopted and become a Codex standard. The battle that this committee is facing is what we have just talked about. It is the battle between consumer health and trade. And unfortunately, very often, trade wins. And we need to be making sure that as this standard goes forward, consumer health, protection, promotion, and support of breastfeeding is right at the forefront of the participants' minds. Codex is a slow process, and you will see that the work on the revision of this standard started way back in 2012. The standard has two parts. The one part that is addressing what is being called follow-up formula for older infants, that's the 6 to 12 month age group, and the other part, part B, addressing what is being called a drink or product for young children with added nutrients, or there's another option governments can choose for this product and naming it a drink for young children, which covers the period from 12 to 36 months. Each of these two parts has two elements to them. The one is the essential composition requirements of the products, and the second is the scope, the description, and the labeling of these products. It is important to note that different elements of the Part A and Part B are moving at different speeds through the Codex process. And some text is already completed and the other is still being discussed. Eventually, when all the texts have been discussed, it will come together and it will then move forward. So matters already discussed and completed are being held at step 7 until the full text is completed, and it will then be joined and submitted to the Commission, as I explained a little bit earlier on the 8-step process. At the upcoming meeting, only matters not yet completed are still on the agenda for discussion. And incomplete matters that are up for discussion are being dealt with piece by piece or section by section. And currently, you will see that there are 3 parts that are still up for discussion at the upcoming meeting at the end of the month. The first are some matters referred back by the Codex Committee on Food Labelling. The second is looking at the remaining sections of both parts A and B that haven't been completed. And then the last is the completion of the scope, description, and labeling for the product for young children. And the 2 areas in this that still are up for discussion is the definition and the nitrogen to protein conversion. There are 2 other very important incomplete matters that will be dealt with when the other sections are completed. And that is going to be the structure of this document. How is it going to look? Is it going to be one document with these 2 parts? Is it going to be separated out into 2 documents? And what will the very important preamble look like? We don't believe that this will be discussed at this meeting. So I'm going to start with the labeling of products for older infants, because there was one outstanding section of 9.6.5 that will form part of agenda item 2 of the upcoming meeting. The history around this is that the last Codex Committee on Food Labelling in 2019 did not endorse the use of the wording cross-promotion that was included in the text. And they sent the text back to the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses to have more discussion about it. Many were saying the word cross-promotion is not a Codex word, it doesn't have a definition in Codex, and a lot of this is pushback from the industry. So the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses in 2019 had to have extensive debate. And when I say extensive, I really mean it. And ultimately, to move forward, compromise was reached, and the text you see below was sent back to the Codex Committee on Food Labelling that just recently met in 2021. Here you will see that the word cross-promotion does not appear in the text. But what does appear in the text are what make up many of the elements of cross-promotion. The use of numbers, saying this is product 1, product 2, product 3, clarity around text statements or images. So the elements of cross-promotion were tried to be covered without the word itself in a compromise. The outcome of the recent Codex Committee on Food Labeling was that this text was endorsed. So we now clearly have 9.6.5 of this has now been endorsed together with the other labeling text for this group of products. Very importantly must always be that this 9.6.5 of the standard should always be read together with 9.6.4, because that also deals with many of these elements of cross-promotion. So those two texts come together to give us as strong as was possible, considering some compromise had to be made around the elements of how these products should not be cross-promoted between each other. With regards to the labeling of the product for young children, it was also referred, an element of it was referred back by the recent Codex Committee on Food Labeling. It will be raised under agenda item 2, but we believe it will then probably be said that let us rather discuss it under agenda item 4. The history of this is that, again, the Codex Committee on Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses in 2019 had extensive debate, and yet again compromise was reached, and the labeling text was sent to the recent Codex Committee on Food Labeling for its endorsement. And you will see that the outcome of that meeting was that the Codex Committee endorsed the labeling provisions, but they did send back one item where they asked that the committee should consider whether exclusion of the term product had happened in the name drink for young children as some kind of omission. So the name issue has to be sent back, but only for discussion around whether the second option of the name should also say drink/product and not just drink. Of course, this means that because the name is being opened, and I mentioned to you the name has been one of the most, if not the most contentious issue discussed at Codex, and was finally settled on with these two options, where countries at the national level will have to determine which name they are going to require for these products to be called in their country. We might find that many will try to reopen the discussion on both the names, because many of us do not like the first name with the added nutrients because we perceive this as being a claim. But it was a compromise text, and it will be interesting to see if the chairs will allow for any discussion other than whether the second option should have product added to it. We will then come to agenda item 4, where the main discussion on this particular standard will take place. And under agenda item 4.1, which is still at step 4 of the process, they will discuss the remaining sections on both the follow-up formula for the older infants and the product, the drink for young children. 15 recommendations have been made by an electronic working group that has been working, and this often happens with Codex, where electronic working groups work in the space between Codex meetings and then present back to the committee on what they have discussed in the electronic working group. And in this work on the remaining sections, 15 recommendations from the electronic working group will be discussed at the committee. We don't have time to go into all of them, but I am going to show you on this slide what recommendations 1 to 9 look like in terms of the issue that they cover. And we can say that as Helen Keller International, we are satisfied with the text that will be put forward for recommendations 1 to 9. However, when it comes to recommendation 10, we have a major problem, because this is a recommendation around whether certain flavorings should be permitted in the products for older infants and in the products for young children. And Helen Keller strongly believes that no flavorings should be permitted in these products, because after all these products, from those for 6 months right up to 36 months, replace the liquid part of the diet and are in fact considered as breast milk substitutes, not complementary foods as some industries and private sectors would like it to be. And therefore, as these are breast milk substitutes, we should not be flavoring them. In addition, we know more research shows that flavorings actually can contribute to developing sweet taste preferences. And this is not recommended at this age group, because it could certainly have a negative impact on food choices and health outcomes throughout the child's life and into adulthood. The 2 documents you see referenced on the right, the indicators for assessing infant and young child feeding practices, recently launched by the WHO and UNICEF, clearly say that sweetened milks are unhealthy foods for children. And the technical scientific report on healthy beverage consumption in early childhood also really does not recommend these products. So we strongly will be urging countries and delegations that flavorings should not be permitted. Following on from recommendation 10, there are 5 further recommendations. And again, these cover the topics that I'm listing here, and HKI feels comfortable with the text that is going to be proposed for these recommendations. This is where, again, a great deal of robust debate, discussion will happen, and where ultimately consensus might have to be reached with some level of compromise. And this will be around the remaining items to be discussed under the draft scope, description, and labeling for the products for young children. The 2 outstanding elements are the definition and the nitrogen to protein conversion discussion. I am not going to spend time on the nitrogen to protein conversion discussion because we don't have time, but I am going to spend some time talking about the very important definition for these products. What I'm showing you on this screen is what the current definition text appears as. And you will see here some text in this block in square brackets. And it is important for me to tell you that Codex uses square brackets when there is outstanding text in a body of text that has already been approved that is still got to be debated. So what you are seeing here, that after many years of debate and discussion and people putting forward their view, there is finally definition text that just has a little bit outstanding in square brackets. So the definition as it currently stands is that the drink or product for young children with added nutrients, or drink, and perhaps they will add /product for young children, means a product manufactured for use as a liquid part of the diversified diet of young children. Text that has not yet been agreed is whether it should also say which may contribute to the nutritional needs of young children. Very importantly, I point to the footnote that has been agreed that in some countries these products are regulated as breast milk substitutes. Many of us fought hard to have the definition state that these products are breast milk substitutes. But ultimately, as it could not be agreed for that text to be in, despite strong views that they should, there were strong views it shouldn't. So it was agreed at the last meeting that there would be a footnote which made it very clear that some countries regulate these products as breast milk substitutes. And this definition must never be read without the footnote. But what remains to be discussed is whether the text in square brackets should be considered there or not. We do believe that the US might even put something forward for the whole definition to be reopened, but we are not certain whether the chair will allow that. So for the purposes of this, I'm going to explain to you what the view around the square bracket text is from Helen Keller International, and our view is supported also by the UNICEF view. We absolutely believe that this text must be deleted, and we provide 6 reasons in our justification for why the text should be deleted. I am not, in the time we have, going to be able to go into detail for each of our 6 justifications, but I'm going to focus on 3 of them that I think are very important. However, we do believe that the Codex procedural manual that says all the requirements that are required have been covered in various parts of the sections of the text and therefore don't all need to be in the definition. We also want to make sure that everyone is reminded that the World Health Assembly has declared that these products are unnecessary, and therefore keeping the text in square brackets will give the impression that they have a role to play in young children's diets, and this is false. They are unnecessary. This reason, I think, is also a very important reason here, is the one about setting precedent. If we look at the definition for the follow-up formula for older infants, we see there is none of the kind of text that appears in square brackets. And therefore we believe the precedent has been set that this kind of text is not necessary, and therefore Part A and Part B should be aligned and consistent, and this text should be removed from this definition. Reason 4 goes into the fact that the mandating certain nutrients to be included in a product or specifying certain levels that are required in a product does not make those products necessary. Member states have agreed that they are unnecessary no matter their composition. And we remind everybody that the benefits of these products over and above continued breastfeeding has not been demonstrated, while there is benefits and evidence for the benefits of continued breastfeeding. So we really do not believe that this text is right or should be there. In addition, many other optional ingredients could be added to these products, and that could change the overall profile of the products, making that text in square brackets untrue and misleading. Further, and very importantly, is that any contribution of these products to the diets of young children certainly does not apply equally across all countries. So having this text in square brackets is misleading. The products may interfere with continued breastfeeding, and there are real concerns around some of the ingredients that are ultra-processed that are allowed in these products. Furthermore, the text in square brackets is outside the mandate of Codex. Codex should not be setting a universal principle as to the nutritional needs of young children. That is the responsibility of member states. And finally, when we were suggesting and pushing hard that the definition should include that these products are breast milk substitutes, I quote exactly what appeared in the report. It was decided that Codex would remain silent on the issue of whether the product was or not to be described as a breast milk substitute. Therefore, there is no reason why Codex should not remain silent on whether or not these products contribute to the nutritional needs of young children. Therefore, this text should be deleted. This is going to be an important discussion at the Codex meeting and is very critical. So here is ultimately the text that HKI, with the support also of UNICEF and many others, would like to see that this would read. As I come towards the close of my session with you, I do want to say that there is also agenda item 4.3, and this is just around the scope, description and labeling for older infants. It is on the agenda, although it won't be discussed, because the text has been completed and is just being held at step 7 until all the text is completed and comes together as one, as I've mentioned earlier. The same applies for agenda item 4.4 around the essential composition. I told you that this work started in 2012, so there has been a huge amount of discussion, and again, this is text that has now been completed and is being held at step 7 until all the text is completed. At that point, all the text will need to come together. It will have to be put into a standard, and there will have to be discussion around what the structure of that standard will look like, and very importantly, what the preamble for the standard will say. So there is lots of discussion still to happen. I hope that for many of you this has been interesting, even if it is just for you to be able to see how Codex works and how long a process Codex is, and how often we really want to have win text, but at the end of the day, Codex works on consensus, so sometimes we have to give up the perfect for the good in order to move text forward. Not everybody agrees with this principle and strategy, but it is how Codex works. We know there will be robust discussion at the upcoming Codex meeting, and we really hope that countries will do everything that they can to make sure wherever text is still open for discussion, that it does what it can to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding, which is what all our children need, exclusively for the first 6 months and continued to at least 2 years and beyond. I thank you for giving me the time and your attention.